Today's occurrence happened in New Zealand. When two tourists visit the New Zealand wilderness under questionable circumstances, things take a turn for the worst, and in a way neither imagined possible. As conditions got progressively worse, only one of them would make it out alive, and with a story that left many wondering why in the world the couple ventured into the winter landscape at all. I am Tatiana, and this is the story of the 2016 Routeburn disaster. "33-year-old Pavlina Pizova and 27-year-old Ondrej Petr came to the South Island of New Zealand in February of 2016. Originally, they worked in Motueka on the South Island, just picking apples before continuing to explore the island. They likely picked apples in the surrounding district's orchards for work as a job. Those areas are just ripe with different fruits. Motueka is a huge tourist hotspot for many different adventure types, including cavers due to having limestone caves to explore, although caves are not what this episode is about. At some point, Pavlina and Ondrej went to Queenstown to find work for the winter. Ondrej was apparently a qualified snowboard instructor, and Pavlina wanted to work in hospitality. As it stands today, Queenstown is a resort town, so even more tourist-centric than Motueka, especially as far as adventure and ski tourism, at least as far as I understand it. And I can see why both places attract tourists like Pavlina and Ondrej, who were Czech. I mean, both places are absolutely gorgeous from what I was able to view online. I mean, much of New Zealand is, but I can definitely see why outsiders flock to those areas. Even locals go to those areas to explore and enjoy the scenery. But Queenstown was originally settled in by the Maori, the indigenous Polynesian people of mainland New Zealand, before Europeans did what they've always done, historically speaking. But they both had a hard time finding jobs, so they decided to spend time going hiking in the Queenstown area before figuring out what they would do next. Pavlina and Ondrej did a couple of walks together just to try and get a better idea of the alpine conditions in the area before attempting to walk the Routeburn. The Routeburn is this roughly 20-mile or 33-kilometer journey going one way. You can hike it in either direction, and it's located in the Fiordland National Park on New Zealand's South Island. But its highest peak is about 4,300 feet or 1,300 meters. Now, I haven't been there, but I did look into this trek, and the Department of Conservation, or DOC, describes it as the ultimate alpine adventure that takes hikers through ice-carved valleys and below the majestic peaks of the Southern Alps. It takes about 2 to 4 days to complete that hike, depending on individual skill level and what track you're taking. There are several different categories for routes hikers can take. There's the wheelchair-accessible short walk, easy short walk, easy to intermediate walking track, intermediate tramping track, advanced tramping track, and expert route. Tramping means hiking. I'll be saying hiking since I'm American, but just know wherever I insert hiking or backpacking, New Zealanders probably call it tramping. Now, for the Routeburn Track, just like many national parks and government-controlled outdoorsy areas, there are in-seasons and out-seasons. Times when those tracks are open, closed, or anything in between depending on the country. Right now, at the time of this episode being released, they're doing predator control. So depending on what kind of controls they're dropping into the environment, depends on what areas of the track might be open, or if it's completely closed, or just whatever. But I digress. Those major hiking trails in New Zealand are called Great Walks. The Great Walks are said to be premier tracks that pass through diverse and spectacular scenery, and they also have seasons. The in-season for the Great Walks, the Routeburn especially, is November 1st to April 30th, at least as far as the 2015 to 2016 season is concerned. That's the best time to walk the track because there are more facilities and fewer hazards. They require bookings for huts and campsites during this time, and the Routeburn Track during this time of year, is squarely in the intermediate track category of difficulty. So it's not expert level, but it's not considered a short, easy walk either. May to October is outside of the Great Walk season, though, at least as far as 2025 goes. The Department of Conservation warns for anyone going outside of the Great Walk season, quote, "It can be cold and wet, with ice, snow, and short daylight hours. Walking the track should only be attempted by fit, experienced, and well-equipped people with alpine, river crossing, and navigation skills. Facilities are greatly reduced, and there are additional hazards, advanced and expert track categories." End quote. So if you don't really know what you're doing, like really know what you're doing, don't do it. There are also fees associated with using the different Great Walks. It varies based on season and if you're an international visitor or if you're from New Zealand. After looking into it, it seems Great Walk season in 2016 seemed like it was from October 2015 to April 2016, but I don't know that for certain. Regardless, it appears that the in-season typically ends around April. There are also several accommodation options for those exploring the conservation places. There's campsites, huts, lodges, cabins, and cottages, also available for a fee, although, again, it varies based on the different options. Before embarking on the Routeburn Track, Ondrej and Pavlina visited the Department of Conservation Center in Queenstown. While they were there, they were told by the staff there not to go on this hike because of the conditions. This story is happening in July. So, besides the local experts just strongly warning them not to do it, it's the off-season, winter. Everything having to do with the Great Walks, especially the Routeburn, as it's one of the most popular Great Walks that's offered in New Zealand, it all warns that it's strongly recommended that people not try those tracks between May and October. Ondrej and Pavlina ignored that advice, though. They decided they would go anyway because no new snow had fallen recently and they figured they'd be fine. In New Zealand, tramping tracks are self-managed, unlike other places in the world. They make it very clear, online and in person, that you are responsible for yourself and that you better be properly prepared for whatever you decide to take on. Pavlina and Ondrej stuck to their plan of going on the Routeburn Track and using that to continue on to the Caples Valley Track and continuing on to get to Glenorchy from there. And based on the maps I was able to get my hands on to kind of figure out their planned path, this wasn't some quick, light, and easy breezy walk. I wouldn't advise even just the Routeburn alone for beginner, obviously. The DOC doesn't either. But the combination of these tracks, it's definitely a lot for the average person. 21 kilometers or 13 miles to get to the Lake Mackenzie Hut alone, which is a location they're aiming to get to, as you'll see. It's very prominent in this story. And that's a lot considering it isn't like a flat neighborhood walk. Well, if they start at the Routeburn shelter and car park at the top of the trail and not the Great Divide car park at the bottom of the trail, which it seems like that's what they did. But they're in the mountains. Stunning as the scenery is, and it is stunning. They have to go up and down with the elevation changes, nearly 800 feet in the air, an elevation difference of about 470 feet or 750 kilometers. To get to the Lake Mackenzie Hut is estimated to take roughly 10 hours split over 2 days, depending on walking speed, and another 5.5 hours on day 3 to get to the end of the Routeburn Track and to the Great Divide. So 3 days to complete this entire track. Once they get to the Great Divide, they would have a few options to pick from on what to do next. One of them being to take the Caples Valley Track that they plan to take around to where they would need to take another track to Glenorchy, but it's not exactly a track. From Caples Valley to Glenorchy, it's a gravel road meant for cars and driving, but people hitchhike on it pretty often. It seems like this Routeburn, Caples Valley, then hitchhike to Glenorchy route is a fairly common thing to do. I'll have a picture of all of this and all of the scenery and stuff I'm going to continue to explain up on the Facebook and Instagram for the podcast, linked in the show notes, just to give a better visual. But that's what I believe their plan was, and that's what a few New Zealanders have told me is their experience and understanding of what happened. Now, how they plan to get back to their car after they made it to Glenorchy, which would have been another leg of the journey, or if they planned to loop back around, or if they had a ride or whatever, I don't know, but I digress. Now, Pavlina and Ondrej decide not to tell anyone about their planned route, including park staff, because they wanted to avoid paying for the use of huts on the track. Allegedly, beyond not wanting to have to pay to use the shelters along the route, the Routeburn Track is actually closed for the winter. Apparently, there were signs telling people it was closed during this time. On July 25th, 2016, Pavlina and Ondrej parked their camper van at the Routeburn Road car park and stayed overnight. The next morning, July 26th, they head off on the trail. They're traveling pretty light for the snowy conditions, not in snow gear, and didn't even bother packing a tent, honestly. But by the end of the first day, Pavlina and Ondrej made it past the first hut, the Routeburn Flats hut, which is about 5 miles or 7.5 kilometers from the start of the hike. In good weather, that section is described as being a fairly easy portion to get through. They made it to the Routeburn Falls hut, a second hut, about an hour and a half past the Flats hut, and they spent the night there at that second hut. No one else was around. Getting to that second location is a fairly decent ascent upwards after the first hut, so it's advised that people really take their time. Again, this is the mountains. To get to that second location was about a 4 hours worth walk away from where they started. At about 10 a.m. the following morning, the couple set off again. They were heading for either the Routeburn or Harris Saddle. Now, leaving that second hut, the Routeburn Falls hut, you have to go over about 1,600 feet or 500 meters of huge rock slabs that are usually wet. People sprain and break their ankles on there all the time if they aren't careful. And the closer Ondrej and Pavlina get to the Harris Saddle, the more narrow the track would have been. At this point, they're basically on the side of a mountain, right? It's not Mount Everest, and it doesn't require Sherpas and the whole shebang, but it's still a mountain. So they have a steep drop-off down the mountain on one side of them and a cliff going upwards towards the summit on the other side. As dangerous as it is, it's gorgeous. I'm sorry, I can't help but saying it. I just watched so many videos of this area for this episode, and I see why people are drawn to it. But as pretty as it is still dangerous. Slipping off doesn't happen often, but it does happen if not careful. On the side with the drop-off is like between mountain peaks, and it's picturesque as heck. Like the river at the base on the side with the drop-off, and there's a mountain on the other side of that river, so there's basically a river between the mountains. But it's still pretty cold, even during the warmer months, so you do have to bundle up, regardless of when you're going on this hike. But at this time, the weather and track conditions, I guess, seemed all right to Pavlina and Ondrej. It's cautioned that during winter, that part of the track has snow covering the path a lot of times, and it's prone to avalanches, and it's actually better to just turn back if you lack experience and proper equipment. But once you get past that point, closer to Harris Lake, you reach the highest point on the Routeburn Track, the Harris Saddle. Now, it usually takes about an hour or two to walk to the Harris Saddle emergency shelter from where they were, but because of how thick the snow on the ground was, it took Ondrej and Pavlina 5 hours on day 2 of their journey to get there. The Harris Saddle shelter is not meant for overnight stays or anything of the sort. It only actually has a toilet inside, for real, and it's for emergencies, as implied by the name. And it's the last shelter until Mackenzie Hut. By this point, Pavlina and Ondrej seemed to be a bit more aware that they were getting into some sketchy territory as far as if they would actually succeed at reaching their goal or not. But even realizing this, they thought it would be more dangerous to turn around and just go back than to carry on. So they kept moving forward, and they saw a sign at Harris Saddle that said it was a 3-hour walk to Mackenzie Hut from there. Both of them saw this and thought the most difficult part of the journey was behind them and that it would be smoother sailing from there. So they just decided to take it as a sign that it was better to continue on, hoping to reach Mackenzie Hut by dusk. They continued on for a few more hours, and by 5 p.m., it was dark. The weather they were hiking in had suddenly deteriorated, and they were pushing through high winds and fog. Out of the few supplies that they did bring along, headlamps were one of them. So they had headlamps on, but even still, they couldn't see more than a couple of feet in front of them. It was pretty much impossible for them to see any track markers at a distance. The area of the Routeburn that they were in, it's possible to get lost, even with the track markers on the trail, during the day if the weather is bad. And at this point, they're walking at night. It led them to getting lost and just hiking around in circles, literally. And at some point, hiking through poor weather in actual circles exhausted them. They had not a clue on where to go, and they were worn out, so they just decided to stay put for the night. And because they weren't at one of those provided shelters along the route, and they didn't bring along a tent or some type of shelter for this multi-day trek, they had to use a vertical rock as shelter. The sleeping bags they used, and a flap, which did nothing to keep out the harsh cold. Snow continued to fall throughout the night. Overnight, Ondrej had started shivering and showing signs of hypothermia. Both him and Pavlina had started to turn completely blue. And Pavlina didn't really sleep because she was scared that they would end up buried in snow. These conditions were pretty extreme to them both. Both Ondrej and Pavlina hadn't done any legit mountain-type trips in the snow, above the bush line, or in any sort of alpine area. So pretty much this adventure was their first time doing any serious hike, like a multi-day backpacking trip sort of situation, let alone in the mountains. And they're in New Zealand wilderness in the winter on a closed route that no one knows they're on. All of that, plus they have almost no supplies for this trip without the snow. With the snow, they somehow thought they could walk the track with no crampons or ice axe. They believed Ondrej was good with maps and had a good sense of their location, and that fueled many of their decisions. At sunrise the following morning, now day 3 of the hike, they could see that they were close to the Lake Mackenzie hut in Fiordland's National Park, which is where this hike is at. Or at least they believed that from where they were looking. The weather was clear that morning, and it gave them this sense of confidence that would prove fatal. Seeing their destination so close made them want to get on with it as fast as possible, to the point where they didn't even bother eating or drinking before they continued on. They woke up and decided to go. They planned to just wait to do all of that eating and drinking and hydrating once they made it to the hut. It would be sort of a celebratory breakfast. Now, the marked track zigzagged down kind of a bit from that point to Lake Mackenzie. And the one typically used to get to where they wanted to go, it's pretty steep. And at this time, not only was it very steep, it was thick with snow. So Ondrej and Pavlina decided to take a shortcut. But they were both unfamiliar with the territory and confused by the terrain. They actually went up the valley instead of going down. They were going in the wrong direction, which left them on the spur as the weather got worse. Now, I'm not sure if the shortcut that they said that they were taking was a legitimate shortcut. From what I can tell, the Department of Conservation strongly advises everyone to stick to the trail, do not wander off of it, even though it's very easy to accidentally wander off. So it sounds like this was just something that they thought they could do. They thought they could just cut through the wilderness to get there faster instead of sticking to the trail. But I'm pretty sure pretty soon they realized that this wasn't the best idea. And at some point, Ondrej turned to Pavlina and said, "We'll give it a go another time." So I'm not sure if he meant that he wanted to turn around and head back home, like they would give the Routeburn Track as a whole a try some other time under better conditions, preferably when the weather was better and the track was actually open for people to hike on. Or if he meant something like they would turn back for now, or maybe backtrack a little bit and try to keep going to Mackenzie Hut and not back home quite yet. Just walk back a bit, wait for the weather to clear, and then keep going to Mackenzie Hut. But whatever Ondrej meant, after he said that, the pair headed down and found their previous footprints. At some point after that, Ondrej took off his pants because he felt like they were a nuisance. At the same time, Pavlina was just over it and exhausted, not to mention definitely probably struggling with hypothermia at this point herself. With them both kind of having a hard time pushing on in the dark, they tried to encourage each other. But once they couldn't continue on, they found an overhanging rock to rest by for a minute. Pavlina decided to keep going on for just a little bit to try and find the designated track to walk on, and Ondrej stayed behind. When Pavlina asked him how he was doing, he told her that he was fine. Now, he was in worse condition than Pavlina, considering that he had been carrying their completely soaked backpack and sleeping bags. Ondrej was carrying it because the gear was so heavy, Pavlina wasn't able to get the thing off the ground. She physically could not carry it. Important side note, the common guideline is for a loaded backpacking pack for multi-day trips to be less than 20% of your body weight. Now, that can vary based on experience, fitness, and trip length. There's base weight to consider and things like that. But for most people listening right now, the takeaway is 20% of your body weight. Anyway, Pavlina came back after going ahead a bit, and when she came back, she found Ondrej had actually taken off his down jacket and was yelling, "It's all buggered." So Ondrej is showing more obvious signs of hypothermia. He's feeling warm and acting a bit loony, and he's taking off his clothes. Pavlina was aware that he was showing these signs, so she quizzed him, trying to figure out for sure if he was hypothermic or not. But Ondrej told her that he was fine and had only taken off his jacket because it was too heavy. After that, Pavlina and Ondrej carried on, I guess still confident that they could reach the hut, so I don't know if they changed their mind about trying again another time or if Pavlina was just following Ondrej's lead, who may have changed his mind and who reportedly wasn't in the best state of mind. But Pavlina could see the top of the ridge from the distance they were moving in, so she took the lead and went ahead with Ondrej following behind her. At some point, she realized that he had stopped moving behind her, though, so at that point, she realized that he was pretty heavily hypothermic. His voice sounded very different, and he was talking about biting wood and other weird stuff. Around this time, the snow suddenly gave way, and it caused both of them to slide down in the dark in what a few reports have actually called a small avalanche. Pavlina lost her headlamp and one of her gloves. It's not clear if they were missing before the fall or if she lost them during the fall. But regardless, she rushed down to where Ondrej landed. He was unconscious and stuck between branches and rocks, still wearing his backpack on his back. When she talked to him, he would respond, but his voice sounded super strange to Pavlina and just straight up bizarre. But she couldn't move him. She was just too exhausted, and the more Ondrej struggled, the more tightly wedged he became. Between the pressure from the branches trapping him and the weight of his backpack, Ondrej started to suffocate. He was audibly suffocating. His gasping was loud, and Pavlina could hear it. In hearing this, Pavlina didn't actually know what to do. She didn't want to push him through the branches to try and free him because a gorge or a cave could have been underneath, but she also couldn't move him in any other way. He was just way too heavy for her. Eventually, she couldn't hear Ondrej breathing anymore. At that point, she found a headlamp in his backpack and checked his pulse. He was dead. She spent the rest of the night with his remains. She wanted to be with him, but more than that, the weather conditions forced her to stay there. In the morning, Pavlina had something to eat and drink. Not sure if she got it from the backpack Ondrej was wearing or if she was carrying food on her. Maybe the food and drinks were somewhere accessible on Ondrej's backpack to where she could get to it without needing to move his remains. I don't think she really clarified that point, at least not that I could find publicly. But after eating, Pavlina kept hiking through bush and rock avalanche debris, at least until she started to lose visibility because of fog. During her continued trek alone, she lost her gloves. I'm not quite sure of the details around that information. I'm not sure if she got another pair from Ondrej's bag, if she got them off of him and his remains maybe, or if she just had another pair on her, which I kind of doubt because why mention you didn't have one glove the night before then? But I'm spiraling too much. Basically, it sounds like she ended up with 2 gloves again, and that night, she again slept out in the open under an overhanging rock while heavy snow fell. The next day, Pavlina finally saw the hut in the valley and made it there by early afternoon. To get there, she had to navigate huge boulders that are around the edge of Lake Mackenzie, and in doing so, she actually fell into the freezing water at one point. Now, the distance from where she was to the hut was only about a mile or 2 kilometers, but her feet were pretty much frozen. There was a lack of visibility, so she couldn't see well, and she was just totally and utterly exhausted, which made the trip take so much longer than she ever anticipated. 2 days to move 1 mile? Brutal. To keep warm without shelter out in the elements before making it to the Mackenzie hut, Pavlina stuffed everything she had in her sleeping bag and just continued to massage her feet almost nonstop. When she finally made it to the shelter location, she looked around the public 50-bed facility. The Lake Mackenzie shelter location, according to the Department of Conservation, during the Great Walk season, this facility requires bookings and has, quote, 50 bunks with mattresses and a communal sleeping layout, water supply, flushing toilets, wash basins with cold running water, but no showers, heating with fuel available, and solar lighting in the communal kitchen area, cooking facilities with fuel, tables, and seating, but no cooking utensils, and a friendly conservation ranger. They like to chat, they know the area well, and can tell you about the environment and weather or help out should an emergency arise. Outside of season, gas is not provided. You will need to bring your own cooking stove. Flush toilets are replaced with pit toilets. Running water is turned off inside the huts. Water can be obtained from the outside water tank. If this is frozen, then from the nearest water course or by melting snow. There are no conservation rangers based at the huts, and beds are on a first-come basis only." End quote. There's a large kitchen and dining area in there, obviously not helpful if you don't have any food though. So Pavlina found the warden's hut. Inside there was food, blankets, firewood, and even a radio, which she was unable to operate because the instructions for working it were in English, which she didn't understand. It was more comfortable and had better supplies than the public facility, so she climbed through a window to stay there, after breaking the window to get inside, that is. Over the following days, Pavlina grieved for her loss, and she nursed her injuries and the frostbite to her hands and feet. She would stay in that warden's hut for the next 24 days. Hi guys, Tatiana here. If you're not new here, you've heard at least one story of how people just like you have gone through some of the worst experiences because the system they relied on to keep them safe failed, or help just wasn't there when they needed it most. If you're someone like me, learning about how these things happen makes you want to be better prepared for disaster yourself, but maybe you don't know where to start. Several listeners have mentioned not knowing where or how to begin, or know how but don't want to go through all of the legwork and finding the right supplies. Well, I've been listening and have put together digital guides and checklists on what you should have when disaster strikes, when systems fail, whether it be because of a hurricane or because you're stranded in your car in the middle of winter. I've put together a free 5-minute customizable plan for you and your family available now, and more in-depth bundle guides with specific product recommendations available for pre-order right now. Use the link in the show notes or visit occurrencepod.com to get your hands on them. And don't forget to follow the podcast on social media so you're up to date on all things Occurrence. See you there. During the several weeks Pavlina was stranded at the hut, she did try to get help and even to leave. Whenever she heard planes fly over the hut while she was there, she waved clothing to try and catch their attention. There were only a handful that flew over in the time she was there, though, but she still tried. And after hearing a few helicopters pass by, she drew the letter H in the snow to symbolize the word help out of ashes from fires she used in a clearing that was near her. She hoped that it would catch the eye of anyone flying above, but it didn't. After a few days, Pavlina even tried to make a pair of snowshoes out of hiking poles she had and wood or crampons in other gear, but it didn't do much. She had planned to continue the track to get to the divide, if possible, which was at the end of the Routeburn Track, but she lost all confidence when the gear that she had tried to MacGyver together fell apart on a test walk. She did try to make her way back to where people would be, but her feet kept her from doing so. They hurt, and the walking gear she made just wasn't up to snuff. Not to mention, the snow was so deep, and she could see avalanches going off every now and then. With all of that, Pavlina decided to stay. It was her best chance at survival. To help pass the time and keep record of her experience, Pavlina wrote several notes about Ondrej. She wrote about him being a natural rescuer, how every time they passed someone in need on the side of the road, Ondrej would stop and help. She also wrote about Ondrej suffering from bipolar disorder, and how she wished he had allowed her to know more about his condition in case she could have helped him more. And I'm not sure if that's referencing, like, she thought knowing more might have helped the decision-making surrounding this hiking trip, or just with, like, in general. Maybe if looking back, she realized that perhaps he was having an episode leading up to this trip or during their vacation, or if she just meant in general during their relationship type of help. But Pavlina had a lot of time to sit and think about things because it took so long for her to be found. The problem was no one knew where she was. No one knew where her or Ondrej were. They didn't know that the couple decided to take this hike. I mean, the trail was allegedly closed and they snuck onto it, so no one was keeping an eye out for anyone on this trail. No one even noticed Pavlina and Ondrej were missing, at least at first. There wasn't a search launched initially because they didn't register their hike with authorities or carry an emergency locator beacon. Had they registered once they weren't logged as leaving the trail and no one could get in touch with them, a search would have begun immediately. An emergency locator beacon would have signaled that they needed rescue to their location way back, maybe before Ondrej even got stuck. While he was stuck, after Pavlina was left alone, honestly, whenever. It wasn't until nearly a month later their vanishing registered on the radar of authorities who could organize some type of search. And it was the Czech consulate that raised the alarm as to their missing whereabouts. And they found them from a random Facebook post. And it reportedly took weeks before friends and family even raised the alarm themselves. Czech consul Vladka Kennett stumbled upon a random Facebook post by concerned relatives of Pavlina at home in the Czech Republic, and that's how the alarm was raised. The Czech consul passed Pavlina and Ondrej's details to the Department of Conservation, and the couple was reported missing to the police from there. Now, after the alarm was raised, police eventually found Pavlina and Ondrej's car at the Routeburn car park, and they had a helicopter with searchers on board in the air pretty soon after they found the car flying along the Routeburn Track. As the chopper neared Lake Mackenzie, they spotted Pavlina jumping up and down in a fluorescent vest in front of the hut at around 1:30 p.m. that day. Now, she was so relieved to be rescued and was described as just being completely overwhelmed by the rescuers, but she was in surprisingly good condition considering the circumstances. Pavlina felt the people who rescued her were heroes, and she informed them about what happened with Ondrej. His body was found the day after in waist-deep snow and steep terrain. There were cliffs around the edge of the scrub he was located at. 2 days after she was rescued, Pavlina gave a press conference at the Queenstown police station. In footage, you can see her holding a written statement, and she's visibly upset, and she did manage to hold it together, at least until the end of her statement. You can tell English isn't super easy for her to read. Don't blame her for that at all. But she explained her experience and how desperate she was for rescue, most of which I already used to fill in the details during this episode. But as for explaining why she didn't leave the hut, she said, quote, "At the hut, considering my physical health, the deep snow conditions, knowing there were avalanche paths ahead of me, I knew it was best to stay in the safe place." Pavlina said she wanted to pass a strong message to anyone planning to hike in the New Zealand mountains, telling people to find solid information and to respect winter conditions and likely rapid changing weather. She went on to say, "I'm aware we made a few mistakes, not leaving our intentions with somebody, not carrying a personal locator beacon, and underestimating the winter conditions on the track. All these aspects contributed to our tragedy." She also took the time to thank everyone involved in her rescue. In later comments, police said Ondrej's clothing was inadequate for hiking in snow and alpine conditions. Detective Alan Lee described the clothing as consistent with that worn for a day or an overnight walk, rather than being suitable for walking in the mountains in the winter. Detective Alan Lee also said that the couple appeared to have a good background in outdoor recreation, particularly with rock climbing and walking, including some overnight camping and tramping. The pair had done some homework about the track, but neither had fully accepted or understood the weather forecast or just straight up ignored them. But mountain experts and those in the media felt her story of survival was odd, if not unbelievable. There was the obvious backlash because both Ondrej and Pavlina ignored advice from the Department of Conservation Visitor Center staff to not go on the Routeburn in the winter. And following that advice, they did not continue to speak to any more DOC staff, reportedly because their intentions not to buy hut passes, I guess. They didn't want that to be discovered that they were going to sneak into the huts. But the weather forecast for the highest point on the Routeburn Track when they were there was negative 11 degrees Celsius. For my fellow Americans, that's 12 degrees Fahrenheit. And the weather forecast was worse the following day. It predicted heavy rain, snow to 1,600 feet or 500 meters, and gale force winds. They were basically up there in a blizzard or snowstorm, and Ondrej didn't have multiple vital pieces of equipment. Honestly, I would call them basic or even below the bare minimum given the conditions. He didn't have a waterproof jacket, waterproof overpants, snow gaiters, and just lacking essential winter hiking equipment altogether. So there was a lot of backlash and a lot of harsh questioning from experts about Pavlina surviving the situation. I mean, she only made it that long in the warden's hut because of, I guess, food left behind by the wardens who don't visit the hut during the winter, and it seems is actually not usually stocked up with food and stuff. Reportedly, Pavlina did her best to ignore gossip and reports following her rescue. The New Zealand police even called all of the commentary unhelpful. Honestly, Pavlina was mostly eager to just get home as soon as possible after she spoke to her family on the phone. But what she took away from her ordeal was that other tourists should always tell someone they trust about their hiking plans and to carry that emergency locator beacon, along with obviously not underestimating New Zealand weather. A few days after she was found and rescued, a body believed to be Ondrej was found and an inquiry into his death was launched. The Mountain Safety Council, or MSC, and the Department of Conservation also investigated. The MSC report really honed in on Pavlina and Ondrej's goal-focused mentality, going as far as to say, quote, "It appears Petr and Pizova did not consider alternatives once they had started the track. The goal-focused mentality continued and possibly underpins the decision to continue on to Lake Mackenzie rather than sheltering at the Harris shelter or returning to the Routeburn Falls hut. The focus on reaching Lake Mackenzie also led them to skip breakfast and head directly down the spur from Ocean Park Corner," end quote. Which, the importance of making sure you're adequately fueling and hydrating your body and mind during expeditions like this is so important for your body to be able to function optimally, but also because your mind is affected when you haven't properly eaten or drank what you need. It affects how you process information, your decision making, and your mood. But the MSC pointed out a few examples of misperception or underestimation of the risks Pavlina and Ondrej encountered. Quote, "It appears Petr, acting as trip leader, made critical decisions along the way. The couple considered themselves more experienced than the public. Therefore, they would be fine, despite the advice they've been given," end quote. The report said that even though Pavlina knew her partner was suffering from hypothermia, by all appearances, she failed to take action to treat or manage it. Reaching the hut was the only option to treat him. According to the report, Pavlina should have given up finding the hut and found a place to shelter from the snow and wind. She was so single-minded. I mean, they both were, but once it was clear Ondrej wasn't in the right state of mind, she should have taken over making sure the priority was getting him to a point where he could recover instead of continuing to push through fatal conditions when he was clearly not in the right state of mind and getting worse in a hurry. But the report was clear that the couple's failure to tell anyone where they were going did not contribute to Ondrej's death, but it did affect Pavlina being rescued earlier. Meaning, if someone knew where they were, it's believed Ondrej may have still died if they made all of the same decisions. But at least Pavlina wouldn't have been alone for a month, ignoring the alleged sneaking onto a closed trail thing. The report concluded that even though the ultimate cause of Ondrej's death was hypothermia, there were a bunch of opportunities to make decisions that almost certainly would have led to a different outcome. The coroner report wouldn't be finished until 2019, but it concluded much of the same, saying Ondrej's cause of death was hypothermia and determined the couple was unprepared and not experienced enough to make informed decisions, thus leading them to taking a shortcut off the main track. Questions around if different signage or more obvious language would have affected the couple's decision to go on this journey came up. A social science manager at the Department of Conservation, Eddie McDonald, said in her report that young males ignore warnings and it's a behavior that's not restricted to New Zealand, and that young males have a propensity for risks, especially physical risks. She went on to say that overseas tourists could overestimate their ability and experience when it comes to adventuring in New Zealand, chalking it up to optimism bias, which she said was very difficult to mitigate, which isn't exactly a new idea for this podcast. Listen to an episode on the Death Valley Germans if you haven't already. It's linked in the show notes. But people, tourists and otherwise, overestimate their knowledge and abilities all the time, especially those with just enough information to not realize how much they actually don't know. That's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, a cognitive bias that happens due to a lack of expertise that prevents people from recognizing their own incompetence. So those with the least skills are often the most confident, while the experts tend to be more aware of the complexity of a topic and typically underestimate their own ability. You don't know what you don't know, but you know enough to think you do know type of thing. The more unskilled someone is in a particular area, the more likely they are to overestimate their skill set, because the same lack of knowledge that makes them incompetent also prevents them from recognizing their own shortcomings. But for experts, it's usually the opposite. The more aware they are of the nuances and complexities of their field, being aware of all that they may still not know, it causes them to be less confident than the less skilled counterparts. The effect can be seen in many areas like politics, the workplace, social media. Example, people with little knowledge of a political issue may feel confident in their opinion, while experts may be more cautious about the statements that they make. It's actually called Mount Stupid. I kid you not. When you start to learn a new thing or learn new information, your confidence soars so fast. That part is called Mount Stupid because it's where you think you know much more than you do, and you don't realize how much you don't know. And then as you do gain more knowledge, if you're someone who chooses to continue to learn and educate yourself so that you're not sitting on Mount Stupid, your confidence sometimes drops significantly as you realize how much more there is to learn. That's normal. That's expected. But with continued learning and experience, your confidence will rise again to a more accurate level. Now, the Dunning-Kruger effect, in my opinion, paired with the optimism bias that Eddie said was present in this case, was just totally fatal. Optimism bias is another cognitive bias that causes people to overestimate the likelihood of experiencing positive events in their future and just completely underestimate the likelihood of experiencing a negative event compared to others. So they have this unrealistic belief that only something good will come out of whatever situation they're in. Main character energy, but to a fatal degree, basically. Optimism bias is a natural human tendency found in about 80% of people. It's also known as unrealistic optimism or the illusion of invulnerability. So it's a pretty common phenomenon if it's in 80% of people. And then you have these two tourists who are unfamiliar with the climate in New Zealand, but one of them is a qualified snowboard instructor that felt he was good with maps and probably felt like he knew quite a bit about being in the mountains and in snow, added to the fact that they had done a few shorter, less intense hikes and thought getting to their destination looked easy enough on paper. They felt they had enough supplies to make it. I can only assume they believed they could just go from shelter station to shelter station until they completed their goal. I can't imagine any other way it would make sense for people to plan a multi-day trip and not even bring a tent, but I digress. They truly believed they were experienced, that they knew more than enough to complete this journey against the advice of the experienced people to that environment. What are like the equivalent of park rangers here in America? I mean, they are park rangers. They're just in New Zealand. If a park ranger or a local here in America tells you not to do something or not to go somewhere on a trail or to go somewhere, you should probably freaking listen. Obviously within reason, don't get tricked by someone or something sinister. Again, I digress. But Pavlina and Ondrej thought that the signs warning people not to go on the trail just didn't apply to them. In my opinion, that the rules just didn't apply. Why pay for using the huts that they obviously planned to use? Why tell authorities they were going on a hike against being warned not to? Again, I wonder if Ondrej's bipolar disorder played a hand in any way, and looking back, hindsight is 2020, maybe Pavlina realized that the decisions he was making that she followed weren't coming from a stable place. But again, just like I mentioned in part 3.5 of the Hurricane Katrina series, that groupthink will get you every time if you don't catch it. But that's just my speculation. That part hasn't been confirmed outside of the optimism bias. So besides that little psychology lesson, the key takeaways from this episode for anyone going to be in the outdoors, multi-day hike or not, is to always check the weather forecast, tell trustworthy people about your plan and when you plan to return, and depending on where and what you're doing, have an ice axe crampons, sufficient winter gear, and a locator beacon on hand. A police inspector said that it was very unusual for someone to be missing in the New Zealand bush for such a long period without it being reported. If that's because people usually have beacons or they have people informed on where they are, so if they don't report back by a certain time, the cavalry is sent out. But I think it's safe to say Pavlina had a good bit of luck and a lot of determination to make it through the situation. Also, please adhere to official park signs. The signage on the Routeburn Track met DOC best practice standards, but it still failed to stop Pavlina and Ondrej from continuing on the path. If anything, this incident should be a wake-up call to be properly prepared for any kind of conditions, any kind of emergency, and especially in Fiordland. Never underestimate the described fast-changing weather conditions and brutal terrain. Stay safe, and see you next Thursday. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.